There is a type of person who is not only toxic, not only destructive. According to Carl Jung, they are the most silent and lethal threat that can cross your path in life. You may already have one close to you. You may be sharing your table with them. Or worse, you may have let them into your trust without suspecting anything. This is the individual who appears normal, who smiles, who listens to you, who makes you feel important while, in secret, they build a story in which you are nothing more than a piece that can be broken or discarded whenever it suits them. And if you think I'm exaggerating, I want you to pay close attention right now to a chilling detail. This type of person doesn't need to shout at you or hurt you explicitly. Their weapon is subtlety. Their poison is manipulation wrapped in affection. This is the most dangerous sign in a person: the total absence of self-criticism, combined with the absolute conviction that their worldview is the only legitimate one. Jung described it as a pathology of the soul, a corruption of consciousness that not only destroys the one who suffers it, but contaminates everything around them. Has this ever happened to you? Being with someone who, little by little, starts making you feel small, makes you question your judgment, your memory, your emotions, who turns any disagreement into proof that you are wrong, that your perception is flawed. And when you finally try to rebel, they look at you with that sinister calm that says, "Poor thing, they don't understand anything." That is the true face of an ego inflated to delirium. But there is something even more terrifying. This profile rarely raises suspicion. The person who embodies this sign may seem like your mentor, your friend, your partner. They may wrap you in compliments and attentions while sowing the idea that without them, you are nothing. Do you know what's most disturbing? That this mechanism is not accidental. It is a pattern. Jung said that this type of personality is so possessed by its own myth of grandeur that it completely loses the ability to see itself as a common human being. For them, any limit is an insult. Any criticism is aggression. Any attempt to equalize them is blasphemy. While you question yourself, while you doubt, while you wonder if you are too harsh or too weak, they never question anything. Never. They live installed in an iron certainty that error, guilt, and defect always reside in the other, never in themselves. Right now, as you listen to this, maybe a name has come to mind, or a face, and you are wondering if it is possible that you have been the target of this soul disease. I tell you yes, because sooner or later we all cross paths with the inflated one, the one who never admits a mistake, the one who turns every conversation into a stage where he is always right, the one who makes you feel that your entire existence is an extension of theirs. And do you know what makes this person an absolute danger? That they have no awareness whatsoever of their own poison. On the contrary, they believe their presence is a gift. They believe they are teaching you something. They believe your resistance is ingratitude. And that is why, the more you try to move away, the more effort they make to trap you in their web of psychological dependence. Don't be mistaken. This is not the typical arrogant personality that yells and threatens. It is something more twisted. Jung explained that the inflated ego becomes an autonomous entity, acting with the coldness of a predator who does not feel like a predator. And that is what confuses most. You won't see guilt in their eyes. You won't see remorse. You will see condescension. If you are thinking you would never fall into that trap, allow me to dismantle your pride. We are all vulnerable, all without exception, because this type of person does not come with a warning stuck to their forehead. they come disguised as a savior, as an ally, as a mentor. And while you lower your guard, they study your fears, your emptiness, your desires for validation. That is how they conquer your will, not with violence, but with the apparent certainty that only they possess the right answer. And if you don't accept it, if you dare to doubt, they will accuse you of being ungrateful, ignorant, cowardly. And if they don't destroy you with direct attacks, they will weaken you with strategic silences and calculated gestures. Jung was clear. There is no subtler danger than an individual who believes themselves enlightened, who does not tolerate criticism, and who feeds on others' submission. Because when your will bends before their narrative, nothing of you remains. Your identity dissolves. Your confidence becomes a caricature. Your voice becomes an echo that only repeats what that person considers acceptable. I tell you bluntly, if you ever notice someone reacts with absolute contempt when you question their ideas, if you observe that they never admit a mistake, if you detect that every disagreement ends pointing out your flaws, walk away. It doesn't matter if it's a family member, a leader, a lover. Ego inflation is a bottomless pit. If you get too close, it swallows you whole. Maybe you think I'm exaggerating, that no one can wield so much power. But tell me one thing. How many people do you know who live trapped in relationships where they feel smaller every day? How many times have you seen someone give up their own clarity for fear of not being accepted by an insatiable ego? Jung wrote it in words that chill the blood. Inflation is always a risk when the individual identifies with something that claims to be superior to human nature. That is the essence of the danger. This type of person no longer considers themselves part of the same species as you. In their mind, they are above all judgment. And when someone believes they are above any moral limit, their capacity to harm is infinite. If you want to protect yourself, there is something you must engrave in your mind. No matter how much their certainty seduces you, no matter how brilliant their speech seems, or how much they promise you, if they lack self-criticism, if they believe they are chosen, if they never admit a crack in their narrative, you are facing the most dangerous manifestation Carl Jung studied in his entire life. The ego inflated to madness. The psychic virus that contaminates everything it touches. And now tell me, how many times have you mistaken this madness for charisma? How many times have you called admirable someone who is only a slave to their own inflation? How many times have you applauded poison, convinced it was nourishment? Think carefully about your answer, because tonight, when you close your eyes, you may discover that you have been living with that monster for years, or worse still, that monster has begun to grow inside you. And while you dive into that uncomfortable question, I want you to understand something even more disturbing. The person with the inflated ego doesn't always act alone. Often, this profile finds a perfect setting to expand. The group, the crowd, the circle that, out of fear or convenience, decides to give them power without questioning anything. And here appears another phenomenon that Jung analyzed with brutal lucidity: psychic contagion. Do you think the inflated ego is only an individual trait? You're wrong. It is a fire that can spread with chilling ease. The contagion happens when a single individual with that excessive conviction begins to impose their narrative, and little by little, those around them start replicating their beliefs without realizing it. And thus a mass is born that does not think, does not feel, only obeys. Maybe you think this sounds exaggerated, that it only happens in sects or extremist groups. But no. The contagion can happen in your family, in your workplace, in any community where a sufficiently confident voice begins to replace individual thought. At first, it seems harmless. A piece of advice, a firm opinion, a recommendation. Later, that voice becomes the only valid reference. What was once debate is now dogma. What was once diversity turns into submission. Jung maintained that the human psyche naturally tends to seek certainties. Uncertainty is unbearable to us, and when someone appears promising definitive answers, most feel relief. That relief is the hook, because behind that apparent clarity hides a trap, the voluntary surrender of your judgment. Do you know what's most sinister? That psychic contagion doesn't require explicit coercion. They don't have to yell at you or threaten you. It's enough with that gentle but constant pressure that makes you feel that dissent is betrayal, that thinking differently is synonymous with ingratitude, that setting a limit makes you an enemy. Meanwhile, the inflated ego enjoys contemplating its work, a circle of people who no longer dare to challenge it, people who have surrendered their mental autonomy to avoid being expelled from the flock, people who, by repeating the same slogans, end up believing they are their own. Have you ever noticed those groups where everyone thinks the same, talks the same, and feels the same? Have you noticed how any dissenting voice is suffocated with a mix of disdain and pity? That is not unity. That is the corrosive effect of psychic contagion, the multiplication of the inflated ego until it becomes a collective monster. And if you think I'm exaggerating, ask yourself why so many intelligent people end up justifying the unjustifiable. Why so many people get stuck in dynamics where those who dissent are humiliated. The answer is simple. Fear of being left out. Fear of losing the approval of the leader, the one who never errs, the one who always has a brilliant explanation for every mistake, always outside their own responsibility. Jung warned that collective contagion was even more dangerous than individual inflation, because when a single inflated ego convinces dozens of people, the damage amplifies exponentially. The group stops questioning and starts defending the indefensible. It becomes a blind entity that protects the inflated ego, even if that means destroying the dignity of each member. But there is something else almost no one tells you. When you enter that circle, you begin to distort your own perception of reality. Your moral compass stops pointing to the truth and starts pointing to acceptance. You don't ask yourself if something is right. You ask yourself if something is approved by the inflated ego. And when you reach that point, your inner freedom ceases to exist. Stop for a second. Think of all the times you have kept silent out of fear of disapproval. Of all the occasions when you looked the other way while someone abused their power. Do you really believe you were being prudent? Or were you just participating in that silent contagion? The true danger of this sign is not only that it destroys the one who embodies it, it's that it turns others into accomplices. And the more people join that complicity, the more untouchable the inflated ego becomes. It surrounds itself with an army of loyalists who will repeat any lie, defend any excess, justify any abuse. I'm going to tell you something you won't like to admit. Maybe you have also been part of that army. Maybe at some point you decided it was easier to praise than confront, that it was safer to agree than question. Maybe you applauded someone you knew was wrong, simply because it was easier than risking their anger or contempt. But I want you to understand this. No group based on idolizing the ego can survive without paying a price, and that price is always the consciousness of its members. Jung made it clear. The more the individual submits to an authority that admits no criticism, the further they move away from their own soul. And when you move away from your soul, everything empties. Psychic contagion is an invisible epidemic. An epidemic you won't see coming because its disguise is perfect. It will make you feel you are part of something important, that you are on the right side, that your loyalty is a virtue. But behind that facade lies the systematic mutilation of your will. So before continuing to live convinced that the problem is only with others, ask yourself this with brutal honesty. What part of you is willing to give up its mental independence for the relief of belonging? How much of your judgment have you sacrificed not to be alone? And what price are you paying to maintain that illusion? Ego inflation is not just an individual spectacle. It is an epidemic that contaminates entire families, entire companies, entire societies. And if you don't have the courage to see that truth, one day you will wake up turned into one of those loyalists who lose their voice in exchange for the protection of a despot disguised as a guide. And when that happens, when you look back and discover that all your thinking has been reduced to an echo of another's voice, it will be too late to recover what you lost. Because freedom of thought does not come back easily, and consciousness that abdicates before an inflated ego rarely is the same again. And while you wonder if all this is not an exaggeration, I want you to think of something very few have the courage to face head-on. What makes the inflated ego and its psychic contagion such a resilient cancer is that they feed on a human need we all share in secret: the need for meaning. The brutal anxiety we feel when we suspect that our existence, deep down, might be irrelevant. It is that anguish that makes many perfect prey, because the inflated ego not only offers certainties, it offers a narrative, a story where you occupy a special place as long as you remain obedient. And there lies the brightest trap. That kind of person makes you feel chosen, as if being part of their orbit redeems you from the mediocrity you so fear. And if you think this doesn't affect you, let me dismantle your illusion. We all carry that fissure inside. Jung called it the shadow, the sum of everything we reject in ourselves. The shadow is the root of self-deception, the hiding place of our guilt and insecurity. The inflated ego detects your shadow like a bloodhound. It senses your weak points, your fears, your desires for approval, and uses them with a skill that borders on diabolical. That is why when you encounter this kind of person, the first impact is not rejection, but fascination. You are dazzled by their poise, their conviction, their way of saying everything as if it were written in stone. And without realizing it, you begin to give ground. First your doubt, then your voice, finally your identity. All surrendered in exchange for a mirage of meaning. Do you know what is most chilling? That many times, the inflated ego doesn't need to manipulate consciously. It doesn't do it like a villain in a novel. It simply believes so much in its superiority that it doesn't even consider another version of reality. And that blind certainty is what makes its influence so corrosive. Because while you question whether you are being unfair, they never question anything. Jung said that inflation is a psychic possession, a kind of trance. And when someone becomes possessed by that absolute conviction that their voice is the only one that matters, what arises inside them is a will to dominate, a hunger to impose their narrative, not only out of pride, but because they believe doing so is an act of generosity, as if nullifying you were a service they are doing for you. And if you think this kind of person only exists in spheres of power, you are mistaken. It could be your boss, it could be your partner, it could be that friend who always has advice that sounds like a divine sentence. It could be anyone who has turned their certainty into an altar. But there is something even more sinister I want you to see clearly. When you relate for a prolonged time with this profile, your own perception of the world begins to distort. You start doubting your memories, distrusting your emotions, wondering if maybe your whole life you have been wrong. This phenomenon has a name: induced cognitive dissonance. It is a process in which your mind splits in two, one part sensing that something doesn't fit, and another that prefers to believe the inflated ego's version because, although it hurts, it is simpler. Because even though their narrative crushes you, at least it offers a sense of order. And here is where the most dangerous mutation happens. When the dissonance becomes unbearable, your mind makes an unconscious decision. It gives up its own voice to align with the others. It is a sacrifice of identity in exchange for a little peace, a devastating exchange that turns you into an echo. And do you know what is worst? That sacrifice is not always obvious. Many times it disguises itself as maturity. You start telling yourself that giving up your judgment is an act of humility, that accepting the other's dominance is a sign of respect. You invent noble arguments to justify your surrender, because admitting you have given yourself up out of fear would be unbearable. Jung explained bluntly, "Most of the evils in this world derive from man's inability to face his own shadow. And when your shadow terrifies you, you seek refuge in any authority that promises to dispel your anguish, even if the price is your inner freedom." But stop a moment. Breathe. Think of all the times you felt that pang of intuition telling you something was wrong, that feeling of discomfort you tried to silence, that inner voice that slowly faded. If you look honestly, you will see that it was in that silence where your own fragmentation began. The inflated person doesn't destroy your integrity in one blow. They erode it with the slowness of a drop falling every day in the same spot. They convince you that doubt is weakness, that autonomy is rebellion, that independence is a defect you should correct. And you, out of fear of the void, accept the deal. And the longer you stay there, the harder it will be to return. Because each day you maintain the facade, your mind fabricates new excuses to uphold it, until one day you look in the mirror and no longer recognize who you are. This is the real damage of the inflated ego. Its ability to invade you without apparent violence, to turn your consciousness into occupied territory, where the only legitimate voice is theirs. And if you don't have the courage to reclaim your judgment, you can spend the rest of your life living in that invisible prison, convinced it is a temple. So I tell you with the coldness that truth demands, no voice, no matter how brilliant, deserves the sacrifice of your thought. No external conviction is worth as much as your right to doubt. Because the day you give up your skepticism, you hand over the key to your mind to the most dangerous predator that exists, the absolute certainty of another. And now that you have seen this uncomfortable portrait, I want you to stop for a moment. Look around. Think about the conversations you have had this week. Remember the gestures, the silences, the looks that lasted a second longer than normal. Ask yourself, with all the honesty you can muster, how many times did you give ground to a voice that did not respect your conscience? How many times did you swallow your words not to disturb the superficial calm of someone who believes they know everything? And here comes the part almost no one is prepared to accept. When you live too long with someone else's inflation, you end up inheriting its seed. Because that toxic certainty, that impermeable conviction, is contagious too. Sometimes, without realizing it, you start reproducing the same pattern with other people. You become inflexible, unable to recognize a mistake, clinging to a narrative where you are always right. That's how the disease works. It goes from victim to carrier without you noticing. This is the darkest legacy of the inflated ego, its ability to multiply from generation to generation, from relationship to relationship. An invisible chain that turns you into what you feared most. And when that happens, when you discover that the voice that used to crush you now lives in your throat, the question is brutal. What are you going to do with that part of yourself? Because no one comes out clean after spending too much time under the influence of absolute certainty. No one emerges intact from a relationship that devours critical thinking. The wound is not only what they do to you, the wound is what they teach you to do. That is why, if you have made it this far in the video, I want to tell you something that is not a self-help phrase. It is a reminder you will have to repeat to yourself every morning. Your judgment is sacred. Your ability to doubt is the last stronghold of your freedom. And if you give it up, you lose everything, even if you keep breathing. Maybe now you feel a strange vertigo, as if a crack opened under your feet. That's okay. That vertigo is the sign that you are not completely asleep yet, that your conscience, although scared, still beats beneath the layers of conformity you have been taught to cultivate. If something I have shared today has moved you inside, if you have felt that uncomfortable pang of recognition, I want to propose a challenge. Don't get distracted. Don't anesthetize yourself with the usual excuses. Tonight, before going to sleep, ask yourself mercilessly, what part of me has been infected by the arrogance of others? And what part is ready to recover its voice? Because only when you have the courage to question your own certainties will you begin to be truly free. And when you do, when you finally dare to look at yourself without masks, you will discover something the inflated ego will never be able to steal from you: the dignity of being human. With all your doubts, with all your cracks, with all your imperfect and beautiful capacity to rethink everything. If this message has impacted you, if you have felt I was speaking to you, subscribe right now. Here we are not going to sugarcoat reality. Here we are going to break it down until it hurts, and then until it heals. And if you want to take this topic even further, I invite you to go down to the comments and write a phrase that reminds you that your mind belongs to no one. My conscience is not for rent. See you in the next video. Or maybe not, because if you decide to keep living asleep, keep giving your voice to the certainty of another, then this channel is not for you. Here we come to wake up even if our hands shake. And if you also want to open your eyes, stay. Next time someone tries to tell you how you must think, look them in the eyes and remember this: arrogance disguised as wisdom always fears those who dare to doubt. So doubt. Doubt strongly. Doubt until the arrogance of others fades away. And now, turn off this video if you can. But I warn you, you will never look at the people you believed invulnerable the same way again. Maybe not even yourself. See you on the other side.